Hi guys, Ross here and welcome back to another video. So this has been a highly requested video. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to create a landscape scene using Cinema 4D and Redshift. So if you don't follow me on Instagram, or if you haven't seen my surreal speed art video on YouTube, it got quite a lot of traction. I got a lot of people asking me how I make it and to make a tutorial as opposed to a speed art. So today is going to be that video. We're going to do a new surreal render from scratch, and I'm just going to talk you guys through the process. So hopefully you guys find this video helpful. If you do, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content, and hit that notification button so you know when I upload. And I also just want to thank you guys as well for all the support on the last video. It did extremely well. Lots of positive feedback on it, so it really means a lot. But yeah, thanks for watching guys, and I'm just going to jump straight into the video now. So if you haven't seen, these are some of the renders I did on my Instagram, just kind of fairly simple like landscape renders, something along the lines of these. And today we're going to try create something similar. I think we're going to go for something fairly simple like this, just so I can kind of teach you guys the methods that I use for renders, for outdoor renders. Okay, so I've got a massive Pinterest board here full of different renders, a lot of landscape ones in here and ones which can help to inspire you, give you inspiration. I usually will look around at stuff like this before to kind of give me ideas. It's good to just kind of look around, get an idea of kind of lighting, composition, colors. All this is good for training the eye for when it comes to making your own renders, so I definitely advise just kind of looking around. Photography is also a great inspiration as well. Let's dive straight into cinema. I've got a brand new scene here, and I am going to be doing this in Redshift, but you can apply these techniques to any render engine. So I'm just going to start with a landscape. Now landscapes is a great tool just for kind of creating hills, mountains, any kind of, you know, landscape that you want. And what I'll usually do is scale this up to something like, I don't know, 10,000 by 10,000, just so it's kind of more it's more of a larger scale. I think I put, there we go. That way we're working more with kind of like life size. I'm then going to ramp up the Y just to give us some shape and maybe play with the seeds here, get a kind of different result. And what I'll typically do as well is, first of all, I'm going to make sure this is the right size for Instagram. But I'm also going to set up my camera, just because you want to be looking through the perspective that you actually are going to use for the final shot. So what I did there was I just reset the camera PSR, which basically you can do with any object, and it's just going to reset it back to 0 on the axis. I've got mine set on the toolbar here, but if you don't, you can press Shift C and type in PSR, and then you have that reset PSR button. So now we're set up with the camera. At the moment we've just got a classic focal length. This is where having some background in photography is really going to come in handy. Typically when people take landscape shots, they're using quite wide angle lenses, so something like 25 millimeters. But 36 is a good starting point, so we can leave it here for now, and we can change this as and when, really. So we've got a simple landscape, and what I'm going to do is actually just set the camera in place. So put a protection tag on that. Just means we can't move around by accident. So let's kind of maybe move this over, and maybe we'll crank it up on the x-axis, and let's duplicate this. So I'm just going to come into my 4 views by pressing the middle mouse button on my mouse, or you can come up and press the window button in the top right here. And I'm just going to position some of these around like this. So what I'm actually going to turn on is the rule of thirds here. This is something that photographers use to create interesting compositions. Usually you want to have like a focal point on one of these kind of intersections here. So usually like in this foreground or in the background. And this just helps you to create a composition which navigates the viewer's eyes. So I'm just going to kind of create like put a landscape there. And maybe we're going to stack these up. Maybe move this one back. And what I'm thinking is that we have these kind of nice subtle landscapes, but then in the middle maybe we have like a big mountain, which would be like our focal point, and then we have like a nice gradient background behind it. So what I'm going to do is actually change this camera to more of a normal lens like this, which allows us to then zoom out. And what I'm actually going to do is I want these to feel smaller, so I'm actually going to shrink them down in size a little bit, especially on the y-axis like this, and that way we can fit more landscapes, or sorry, especially in the z-axis, so they're not as long. That way we can squeeze more in the foreground like this. Maybe bring down the height on this like that, and I'm just going to make sure these are budged up against each other. And maybe we can do the same with these ones back here, just shrink these down. That way we can layer up more landscapes. And play with this. I'll play with a seed on these as well. I'm just going to keep stacking these up. So something like this. Probably bring down the height on this one. And it might be that we want to lower the camera and go up on the p-axis for the rotation. That way we're kind of more eye level with the landscapes. So we got something like this. What I'm going to do is create like a kind of mountain focal point here. So let's duplicate one of the landscapes, move it here, and then we're just going to crank up the y-axis on this. So something like this. And then we probably want to take out some of the detail on this, because if you were to think of it, if in real life this mountain's going to be quite far away and you're not going to pick up on as much detail. So we'll take out some of these rough furrows as well as the fine ones. Maybe bring some of the rough ones back in, and we can play with the scale as well. So if I just bring that scale down, so we're going to get some deformation in there, but it's not going to be as drastic. And what I actually want is I kind of want it to like slope down and out instead of it having this arch shape. So what we can do to achieve that is we could probably play with this sea level. If I come out of the camera, you can see that if we adjust the sea level, it's essentially raising like an invisible sea level which is covering our mountain, so we can use this to kind of add some more shape to it. So something like this, and then if we come back into our camera, now we have a bit of a nicer shape, and we could, there we go, do something like this. We can play with a seed on this to find something we'd like. Okay, that's a bit crazy, but it's pretty cool. We could bring that down, have it like that, and then that's more of that shape, that's more of the shape we wanted. So let's bring that down, something like that, and then maybe we could shrink the actual width of it down as well. And let's play with the scale and stuff on this. So you can have it something like this. Maybe turn down the amount of rough furrows and turn up the fine furrows. It's just got a tiny bit more detail in there. And what I'm actually going to do is add a subdivision tag to this. So I can just grab that, alt click, and that's going to make it a child. And now it's smoothed it out a little bit more. So I'll probably do the same with these, but the better way to do it for Redshift is to get a Redshift object tag and just turn on the tessellation. It's not going to update it in the viewport, but when we go to play it, we'll be able to see them smoothed out. So I'm just going to put that tag on all of these, and then I'll do the same with the mountain and just get rid of that subdivision. And now it's looking pretty decent. So I'm just going to save this so I don't lose it for any reason. So the main thing we want to do, which is going to help with this a lot, is bring a light source in. Now there's a couple ways we can do this. Okay, so I'm going to use a Redshift dome light, which is basically like a HDR. You should be able to use this in any render engine. And let's try find a nice HDR. That's probably not a good example. We want something which is kind of reflecting the environment that we want this scene to be in. So I'm going to go through Hdri Skies until I find something which works. This is quite cool. Gives us quite like a dark nighttime vibe, but still not quite what we're after. I know I've got some bright ones in here, 100%. And I'm just going to put this in clay mode as well for now, which is still going to show us our HDR, but we can also It's just going to take any texture out of the equation. Okay, so I've set up a HDR here. It's like a fairly simple kind of sun desert HDR. And I've got the sun over to the left hand side, which is casting these shadows over to the right. So obviously this is the nice lighting, but the background isn't what we want. So there's a couple things we can do. First of all, we can turn off enable background, and we can then duplicate this dome light and turn on the background, but then go into ray and untick effect diffuse and effect specular. So now this is essentially just working as a backplate, which means we can change the background to be at an angle we want, maybe something like this, but it's not going to affect the actual lighting of the scene. So we could leave it as something like this for now, which is quite nice. And now we have the HDR key, so that's our key light, and then we got the HDR backplate, if I can type properly. There we go. And I'll just drag both of these into lights. Okay, so we've got quite a simple lighting setup and scene, but I think we can still work into it a bit more. So I'm just going to maybe put another landscape behind the mountain, just to kind of help add some more depth to this. Cool, something like that. And then if we go for a classic lens like this, this is going to help to give it more of that landscape feel. It's going to make it feel like there's a bit more distance to this scene. I think we could probably shrink these foreground landscapes down a bit. So let's maybe move that. Okay, so what I've done here is I just kind of switched up the composition a little bit. I've filled it out with more mountains. So now we've got a lot more in here, which makes it feel a bit more of a landscape. There's more objects in there, more shapes and sizes. Just helps to give it a bit more scale as well. So the only thing I'd probably do is just go in and change the fine furrows in some of these. So the ones up close you want to have a bit more detail in. So I could probably plug a bit more fine roughness and rough furrows in these, which is going to help to give it more of like a desert kind of vibe. And you can probably put the scale up on these since they're going to be closer. And then as you get further away, even though the scale should help, you can then start to dial these settings down, which is going to help to add in that that sense of scale, that as you get further away you see less and less of the detail. So I'm just going to dial those in. Okay, cool. So now we've got some sort of kind of like desert vibe going on. I don't think the lighting is perfect still, so what I'm probably going to do is go into this and tweak the lighting. So I'm going to turn off that backplate, and maybe let's try use something like, actually we can, so what I'm going to do is actually turn off the HDR key, just so we got no lighting, and maybe try use something like a Redshift Sun and Sky rig, and have a look at what we can get out of this. So we can get quite a cool like backlit vibe to it. We could add like a sunset to this, which would be quite nice. So maybe we'll try with something like that. So now we've got brighter lighting, we can start to see some areas where there's duplications. These two here look quite similar. So let's just kind of play with the seeds on this and until we get something that looks a bit different. Okay, cool. So this is looking pretty good. I think we can tweak the lighting still. So what I'm going to do is turn on that HDR we had before, and see if we can get those working. So let's have a look at this. I'm just going to zero it back out. I'm just going to turn the background on just so I can kind of get an idea of where the sun is. So it's around about there. Okay. Okay, so that's like a backlit scene. You can see the sun is behind the landscape, so now it's lighting it from behind, which gives us quite a nice like sunset-y feel. If we were to put it somewhere like this, it's quite nice. Okay, so now we've got quite like a backlit feel, so what I'm going to do is actually turn the background off on this and then just reflect this with the sky. So let's put the sun behind it like that, which is just going to help to add some extra lighting. If we were to turn that off, you can see now we've got a lot more vibrance with it on. So we got quite a nice like daylit feel now, from like a backlit daylight feel. So let's find a backplate to reflect that. So let's have a look through here and see if we can find a nice sunny HDR. Okay, cool, like that. And to finish this off, what we could do is maybe have like a nice sun right at the back. Scale this all the way up. Just have this creeping up above the mountains, and let's put the subdivision up on that, and then a redshift object, which is just going to help to smooth it out. And I'm actually just going to put all these mountains in another null just to keep things organized. So we can call this landscapes. Cool, like that. And then maybe add like an incandescent, and make this like a nice reddish kind of color, like the sun. And then we can use something like bloom to add some glow to that. Maybe use a ramp for the color just so we get some sort of change. So put that into color. Have this as like a deep red, like this. And then this can be like a really bright orange, like that. And then just fade that out. And then turn this all the way up, and now you have like this really nice glowing sun. So we're turning up the intensity, you're making the light brighter, which means the bloom will pick up on it more. Only thing now is I feel like it doesn't really reflect the background behind it, so maybe we want to have another look at what we can do for that. So okay, so let's go on Hdri Skies and find a nice simple sunset sky. So sunset, here we go. Something like this could work quite well, or this one's perfect here, sunset sky 385, which I probably have hiding somewhere. So let's have a look. 385, here we go. And now you have this nice kind of gradient background, which is perfect. And we can just level that back out. Cool, so now it's just a case of adding texture to our actual landscapes. And what we could do is add something cool, like adds a level of water in here. So I'm going to grab this plane and scale it up to the size of all our landscapes. So let's do that. Something like this. And now you get like a completely different look. So if I was to bring that in like that, and we can drag it down just so it kind of just shows through some of it, like this. And we can use this to create water now. So if I grab a new material and literally just use the preset water, there we go, and drag that onto our plane, Now we get these nice reflections from the sun and from the sky. Okay, so at the moment the water looks pretty simple. What we could do is add some kind of like subsurface scattering to this, so maybe something like 0.7. That's going to turn it into more of kind of like a milky water, I suppose. And we can actually put some colour into this. Turn it up, so now we have like this red water, which has got a bit of roughness to it. And we could bring this plane up so it covers more of our landscapes, so they're more flooded, like this. And now you've got something quite interesting going on. We could probably turn this back into like normal water now, so let's turn off that scatter scale, and now we have this kind of water like this, starting to get some of the sun reflection in there. And what if we applied something to our mountains? So at the moment we got quite a shiny material, but we could turn these into like a nice desert material, quite sandy. So like this yellow, and then probably take all the shine out of them, so crank that roughness all the way up. Or crank that reflection all the way up. Bring that yellow back a little bit. And now you've got this kind of weird contrast of red and yellow, which looks a bit strange. Maybe we could blend that in a bit more, so maybe make this a bit of like this lime greenish kind of colour. Maybe not like that. And then we probably want to turn the absorption scale down so we're getting more of that colour we originally wanted, like this. Now you've got this cool yellow water mixed with quite like a deserty material on the landscapes. And I think now we've started to texture this, you can start to see some of the issues we're coming in. So some of the things that don't look quite right in this scene. So I feel like there's a lot of landscapes, and now I want more of a balance of water in there. So maybe it's the case of first of all I'm going to turn off materials so I can see this better. Maybe I want to drag these down so this is kind of sinking into the water more. Same goes with these back ones. I probably don't need as many, so I'm going to delete some of these back landscapes, probably keep those in, but maybe something like that. Bring this landscape down so it's sinking more into the water. Same goes with some of these down here, probably sink those in. Cool, right, I'm really happy with how this is looking, so let's start to populate this with some plants. Okay, so let me show you guys how I'd go about putting some like plants on these landscapes. So I use mega scans for a lot of my plant assets and just general kind of texturing object assets. So I've got a bunch downloaded if it signs me into my account, which I'm hoping it should in a minute. Okay, so I've got a bunch of stuff downloaded, so loads of like plants, so it's just trying to find something which is relevant to the scene, and this is where finding references is going to become really helpful. And what do we see? So most of them are pretty empty like this, but if we were to go through, some of them have these kind of like not like bushes, but some sort of like shrubs, I suppose. So these you can see kind of small clumps of grass. So let's try find something similar to those. So I'm going to go into the grass section, and these thatching grasses are quite good. So swamp grass, that sounds perfect. So I've already got this downloaded, so I can literally just hit export, and it's going to bring it into my cinema file, and you get a bunch of variations. So what I'm going to do is just put all those in a group. And what were they? Just so I can name this. So they were swamp grass, so I'm going to call those swamp grass, and I'll create a new folder and I'll just call this grass assets, because I'm then going to reference these to scatter them. So what I'm going to do is come up to Redshift objects and matrix scatter, and this basically works the same as a cloner. You actually have the scatter, or sorry, you actually have a matrix built into MoGraph, so there's literally no difference between the Redshift matrix and this one, but this uses a Redshift object tag to populate the objects. You can even see that it's the same MoGraph icon. So I'm going to set this to object, and basically here I have to select an object to scatter these along. So what I'm going to do is actually just grab that landscape null and put it in here, and now that means it's populated these landscape full of objects, but we haven't told it what objects to use yet. So what I'm going to do is actually come into my Redshift object tag, come to particles and change this to custom objects, which is going to allow us to essentially drag in any objects we want to scatter along the landscape null that we just put into the matrix object. So I'm going to select all these, come back to my Redshift object tag and drag them in. And at the moment we can't see anything. Why is that? I think that's because maybe they're too small. So let's scale these up, maybe like 10 by 10 by 10. Still nothing going on. Okay, maybe we need to select an actual object. Yeah. Okay, so it seems like the nulls don't work, so we're going to have to do them manually. So what we can do is just select the landscapes we want. So maybe I'll have someone here, and let's scale them back down now. So 1 by 1 by 1. Maybe that's too small, maybe like 3 by 3 by 3. And let's just duplicate these and use them for different landscapes. So maybe I want some in this foreground here, so that's landscape 12. So I'll drag that into the matrix, and now we have some scattered on there. Maybe 20 is not enough, so maybe we put it up to like 100. That's probably too much. Maybe I'm actually going to scale them down as well. And I want to add some random to the matrix as well, because otherwise they're all going to be the same. Randomize these by about 10 centimeters each. And then also we can add some randomization to the scale. So if I select a uniform scale and then maybe put like 0.5, each of them would be randomized by half of its original scale. That can be decreased or increased. So maybe I'll put that to like 0.2 instead. And then rotation, which is a main one. So maybe put like 30 on each of these. So they all slightly vary. Cool, and you can crank these way up, so I could have literally like 1,000 on each, which might make the PC crash, but we'll give it a go. And now you can see much more has been scattered along our landscapes. I could put this up to 10,000, and the matrix is quite good. It can handle quite a lot of these objects because it's essentially just cloning the original one. Maybe to 100,000, see if that crashes it, which I think it might do. Cool, and these are probably the kind of numbers you'd be playing with if you wanted to properly populate this. So now we've got like very much a grassy surface, which kind of looks quite cool. But I did like the desert vibe that we had going on, so I'm just going to crank those back down to like 1,000. So I'm actually just going to take the Y position off this random because I don't want them to leave the surface. So now they're 0, they should just be stuck to those landscape objects, which is how we want them. So now you just get some subtle grass in there, and what you can actually do is add some like plane effectors to these matrices, and you could use fall-offs to stop them from showing in certain areas. So I'll just show you quickly how to do that. So if you come to your matrix, go up here to MoGraph effector plane effector. So I'm going to do it on this first matrix just so we can actually see what's going on. So these ones in the middle here. So if I drag the plane into the effectors, you can see by default it's scattering them around because the position on Y is set to 100, and because it's a plane effector, it's going to move them all by 100. It's not like a random where some will move 100, some will move minus 100. They're all going to move in the same direction, so you can use this to create some cool effects. What we're going to do is actually use this to hide them in certain areas. So I'm going to come to the fall off and put something like a spherical field on here, and if I scale this up, it's basically only going to affect the objects within that sphere. So if I just find that landscape that they're at, make sure I lock that camera. So here, so if I just make sure that spherical field is over the top, you can see now some of them are starting to hide again because they're being affected by the fall off. You can see they're starting to turn purple. So you can use this to do quite a few things. So at the moment it's stopping, or it's only affecting those objects within that sphere. But if I come to the fall off and come into the remapping and invert it, that means everything outside of that circle is being affected. So you can move this around and create some cool effects. But if I did something like come into the plane effector, go to scale and set absolute scale to -1, that means everything now within that sphere, it's only showing what's inside that sphere because everything else has a minus scale, so it doesn't exist. But if we now go back into our spherical field and untick invert, it now means everything inside that sphere is invisible. So you can use these fall-offs to hide objects in certain areas, and you can stack these. You could have multiple fall-offs and just hide them in certain areas. But this is a really powerful technique to like kind of mask where you want your objects to be shown. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how this scene is looking at the moment. The only final thing I'd really do is I'd start coming in here and adding some post-production settings. Adding some post-effect settings. So at the moment we've got a bloom, which is giving us this nice glow off the sun. You can see how much of a difference that makes because you get this nice shine come off, which kind of gives it a more realistic look. Another thing I usually do is sometimes turn on the photographic exposure. So this is where you can start to input real life camera settings. So I could put in an f-stop of 5.6, which is to do with how much light it lets into the camera and also the depth of field. We could crank the shutter speed down to like 200. And by default, it's going to allow desaturation. So if I was to untick this, it's going to go back to our normal color. But you can see it feels a lot more washed out, and that's because it also has this other setting called allowed overexposure. This is really good if you've got really bright areas in your scene, but they're just blown out. You can use this slider to affect how white it's going to allow those kind of diffusers and reflections to be. So we could crank this up a tiny bit, which is going to bring some more of that contrast in. But usually by default, or usually by turning this on, you can allow yourself to get more realistic results because it's using the camera settings. There's a bunch more settings in here you can use. You can crank up the saturation or bring it back down. I'm just going to leave that at 1 for default. You can also crush the blacks in here, so give it some more contrast. Again, I'm going to leave that at default, and I'm going to pretty much leave the rest of the settings the same. So that's made it a bit more washed out, but it's allowing us to reduce the amount of overexposure, which now means we can just pump more of that detail back into something like the exposure and contrast. So I could put a bit of contrast in this, and you can see just tiny numbers are going to make quite a bit of difference. So if I do something like 0.05, that's added a nice bit of contrast in there. And then I might just want to drop down the exposure a tiny bit, so maybe something like -0.1. Just helps to add a bit more contrast, but doesn't overexpose it. And then maybe you want to go into the photographic exposure and just reduce that overexposure amount just so the whites aren't too blown out. That looks quite good. And then you can use the curve graph here. So I could just add a bit more contrast that way. Maybe pump those highlights back up again, or drag them back down depending on your scene. Maybe you want to give it a much kind of darker vibe, and you can do that by just dragging around these sliders. So you can do a lot of the post-production kind of within cinema. Just stops you having to maybe always go to Photoshop, especially if you're doing something like a render for Instagram. It just takes another step out of the process. So this is quite cool. We've added a bit more contrast in it. I think it's quite saturated at the moment, so maybe I'll just bring the saturation down just a tiny bit, maybe like 0.9. That looks quite nice. And then finally we have Luts, which are kind of like presets for color correction. So we can turn these on, and by default you get a bunch built into Redshift. I'll usually always have a scroll through this and see what I can find. This is quite nice, and I could just reduce this down to like something like 0.3, so now it's only doing like 30% of its full strength. And that's just helping to pump a bit more color in, and then maybe it might be a case of I want to bring some more saturation back in, so I'll set that back to 1. Maybe I'll go 0.95. and bring the exposure down. So I'll go into my color controls and just bring that down a tiny bit. And now you've got like a really nice looking render. So these post effects are really worth looking at, kind of figuring out what they do a bit more and really digging into it. What I'm actually going to do is turn off those matrices. I don't think they're working, but I kind of wanted just to talk about them for the sake of the video. And I think we're pretty much done. So I'm going to hit render on this, and I'm actually going to kind of be a bit cheeky and go into the system, experimental options, and enable automatic sampling. This means I don't have to faff around with any of the sampling overrides. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this all the time, but when you're doing kind of quick renders like this, it can be really useful. So I'm just going to find where to save this. So in here, I'm going to create an outputs folder. And let's just call this Surreal Tutorial. And that all looks good to me. And I'm going to hit render. So this shouldn't take too long. You can see it's flying through it pretty sharpish, and that's because we're not using loads of geometry. We're using fairly simple landscape objects, just with a Redshift object tessellation to smooth them out. We've got a fairly simple water material in there and a sphere in the background, and then we're using HDR, sun and sky, and a backplate to kind of do all the lighting for us as well. So we're going to look at our final render in a minute once it applies the post effects, and I think we'll be done. So it's just going to process those, and that's our final image. So hopefully you guys found this video helpful. If you did, make sure to smash that thumbs up button. It really does help me and the channel out. If you want to see more content like this, hit subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when I next upload. If you want to see more videos on how you do scenes like these surreal landscape scenes, let me know in the comment section down below. I'd really be interested to see whether or not you found this helpful. Maybe I didn't cover everything you wanted me to in this video, so I could put another one out on a slightly different render. So yeah, let me know in the comment section down below if this video was helpful, and I will catch you in the next video. Alright, thanks for watching guys. Peace.